I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Bristol Law Society, who are hosting the webinar today. My name is Coralie McKeivor. I'm the Honorary Secretary and on the ED&I committee here at Bristol Law Society. As I mentioned, we're doing a lot of webinars at the moment, and we're doing weekly webinars, of which this is our special ED&I webinar for Black History Month, and we will be talking today about allyship for anti-racism, what, why and how. And I'd like to say a very special thank you for Burges Salmon and the internal network Be Cultured for putting together this talk and panel event today. We're joined by a number of people from Burges Salmon who will, Priscilla will introduce in a bit. We've got Priscilla, Osoba, Jamie Cameron, Nikoletta, Zinonos, Emily Clarke, Joelle Chess and Sandra Mapara, who are solicitors, trainee solicitors and senior associates. So we get a full range of experiences from inside Burges Salmon today. We have had a lot of questions in advance, which is really good, and thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Hopefully we'll be able to get through as many as possible. As you may have noticed, there's a record symbol in the corner of the screen. We will be recording today's session, and it will be made available after the session on our YouTube channel for the benefit of people who may have not been able to join us today. And so I would like to hand over to Priscilla to finish the talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Coralie, and thank you all for coming to today's webinar. As Coralie has said, I'm Priscilla. I sit on the management committee of Be Cultured, which is Burges Salmon's BAME network, and I'm delivering the session today with Jamie, Nikoletta, Emily, Joelle and Sandra, who are all also Be Cultured members. And we're going to be talking about effective allyship in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. So while the statement that Black Lives Matter has always been true, the Black Lives Matter movement began in 2012 following the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin by Neighbourhood Watch member George Zimmerman and his subsequent acquittal. This was one of just many incidents that highlighted the apathy towards the violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. Black Lives Matter became a rally cry in the aftermath of the killings of Mike Brown, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Tatiana Jefferson, and numerous other Black men and women murdered as a result of state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. The killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor earlier this year exposed the deep-rooted inequalities faced by Black people in the US and sparked a resurgence in the Black Lives Matter movement. This resonated around the world, and many people of all races have since sought to identify what actions they can take to eradicate racial injustice. Over here in the UK, many have seen the footage and read the stories coming from the US and taken comfort in the belief that the UK isn't as bad. However, multiple studies have shown that outcomes are consistently worse for Black people in the UK as compared to both white groups and other ethnic minority groups. For example, the percentage of Asian lawyers in law firms is 15% and the percentage of Black lawyers is 3%. It's also worth noting that had the percentage of Asian and Black lawyers been aggregated to 18%, this might have given the impression that both groups are overrepresented, despite this not being the case. Black school leavers with A-levels are on average paid 14.3% less than their white peers. 6% of Black school leavers went on to attend a Russell Group university, compared with 12% of mixed race and Asian school leavers and 11% of white school leavers. 46% of people in families where the household head is Black are living in poverty, compared to 19% of those living in families where the head of the household is white. 16% of white British households rent social housing, versus 44% of Black African and 40% of Black Caribbean households. Black men are 5 times more likely than white men to be stopped and searched by police in England and Wales. Black women are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy than white women. Asian women are twice as likely as white women to die in pregnancy. For mental health, Black adults have the lowest treatment rate of any ethnic group at 6.2%. The treatment rate for white adults is 13.3%. So as you can see, this inequality spans the justice system, healthcare, education, and the world of work. The UK has a systemic racism problem. This means that racism is so ingrained in political and societal organisations that it's seen as normal. Its continued prevalence relies not on outright racists screaming the N-word, but on the inaction of people like you and me. Professor Eduardo Bonilla Silva, a Duke University sociologist who studies the collective and structural phenomena of racism, explained that the essence of understanding the definition of systemic racism lies in knowing that regular people within a system are an essential part of that system. Even something as seemingly benign as a neighbourhood choice or your own group of friends is an action that upholds a particular racial order should they intentionally, or more likely unintentionally, uphold the status quo. When you're in a system, all of your actions within that system play some part in either upholding or dismantling it. So to summarise, in the words of famous civil rights campaigner Angela Davis, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. This means being an ally to Black people in the pursuit of racial justice. So what is an ally and what does it involve? An ally is defined in the Rochester Racial Justice Toolkit as a person of privilege who works in solidarity and partnership with a marginalised group of people to help take down the systems that challenge that group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. As we'll expand on later, the idea of privilege doesn't mean that all white people are well off and leading strong free lives. It just means that race, or more accurately racism, is not a barrier to success in the same way that it can be for Black people. So what does being an ally involve? In short, listening, learning, reflection, and speaking up. And we'll expand on each of these throughout this presentation. We also want to note that while this presentation focuses on allyship with Black people, these principles can be applied to allyship with any marginalised group. So the first step is listening. Conversations around race can be very difficult and uncomfortable. This, however, doesn't mean that we should avoid having them. The fact of the matter is that people are often unaware of issues that don't affect them. You may not know, for example, what it's like not to be able to walk into M&S and buy nude tights for work, or to feel like you have to dress slightly smarter when you go to shops to avoid being followed around by security guards, or what it's like to be in the car with your dad while he's stopped by the police again for fitting a description. It's important to listen to Black people and understand how racism affects our day-to-day lives, so that you as an ally can recognise where racism may be at play and know when to call it out. So some tips for enabling these conversations. First, create a safe environment. Don't spring these conversations on people. Countless studies have shown the adverse physical and psychological effects of racism, and uncovering these traumas needs to be handled with care. Ask ahead of time if your Black friend, colleague, or relative would be comfortable talking to you about their experiences. Next, listen empathetically. Listen to understand how they're feeling and allow them to share without interruption or defensiveness. And finally, don't offload your guilt. The point of these conversations isn't to make white people feel guilty. Next, it's essential to learn. People are usually very good at identifying overt racism and even patterns of incidents or events, but it can be less easy to recognise how racism manifests in societal structures. As I've mentioned previously, it's often so ingrained that it's seen as normal. One reason for this is that we tend to lack a lot of the historical context for understanding racial issues today. For example, the British Empire is often framed in the school curriculum as a great time of exploration and trade, with little to no mention of the land stolen from and heinous crimes committed against Indigenous people. Britain's role in ending the transatlantic slave trade is amplified and even manipulated, as you can see from this HM Treasury tweet from 2018, which suggests that taxpayers helped buy freedom for enslaved people, when in reality these were funds being paid to slave owners to compensate them for the loss of their property as recently as 2015. We learn little, if anything at all, in schools about the Bristol bus boycott, the Notting Hill riots of 1958, or the Mangrove 9, pivotal moments in the British civil rights movement. Instead, education tends to be confined to American movements, perpetuating the idea that racism is just an American thing. There are plenty of books, films, reports, and other resources for learning about racial inequality in the UK, which were shared widely in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. And engaging with these is a good step to take if you want to understand some of the issues faced by Black people throughout history, as well as today. Now I'm going to hand over to Jamie, who will share some reflections from his learning process.
Thanks, Pri, and thank you for an excellent introduction to the session. As Pri said, I'm going to talk about listening and learning, and to start with, I wanted to speak up about some personal reflections from the listening and learning I did in the aftermath of the toppling of the Colston statue, which for me was a particular trigger to reflect and face some uncomfortable truths, I think. Now, I've got to be careful that I'm not offloading guilt here, as Pri talked about, but I think what I'm going to talk about generally reflects a number of points Pri's already made, but also how a number of other white people I've spoken to feel. And I think summary of where I got to is I was certainly guilty of thinking that things were not as bad in the UK. I'd become fairly desensitised to events that I'd heard about, and in fact, the fact that toppling of a statue had more of an impact on me to reflect than the death of George Floyd was fairly uncomfortable and embarrassing, and that isn't okay. And I was probably comfortable that I wasn't intentionally racist, and I wasn't seeing that in friends. I wasn't seeing overt racism, but I was probably missing a lot that was either going on elsewhere or the structural issues. And I didn't realise, I think, the privilege that I had. And I think the biggest realisation for me was, and Pri mentioned the quote earlier, it isn't enough to be non-racist. We do need to be anti-racist because of the structures that have been set up. And I was trying to think of a good way of describing how I felt, but essentially I think what the period made me feel was, or realise, was that I was fairly ignorant. And it might sound better if I described it as sheltered, oblivious or naive, but ultimately what I think it comes down to is a lack of education. And I mean that in the broader sense, both as Pri described, sort of what I learned at school, which probably focused on the positives around the end of the slave trade rather than the reality of involvement in it, but also I think on an ongoing basis, the information that I take on, both with the people I speak to and the publications that I probably read. And that I think is where effective listening and learning comes in. And I think the period of reflection that I went through earlier this year, I would say, has led me to a position now where I do feel more comfortable. I feel slightly better educated, but it's ongoing, but I feel more comfortable speaking up, which I think, as we'll go on to talk about, is really important. And a clear example of that for me was how on the Sunday when Colston statue came down, I heard a comment about, well, all lives matter. And I let that slide. Whereas 4 days later, having done a lot of reading and listening, I heard a similar comment being made, was able to speak up and address it, and subsequently heard the person I spoke to about it have a similar conversation with someone else. So you can see the value of education both to yourselves, but how that can spread more widely. And from my experience, I wanted to mention, I think, 3 particular points. First one, about listening and learning. I think open conversations and dialogues, as Pri has talked about, is really important. But I think one of the barriers for that sometimes can be a concern about saying the wrong thing, and the fear of that can actually hold people back from having that conversation. And what I found most useful personally was was actually reading and becoming more familiar and more confident with the issues in the background before I then embarked on the discussions. A really good starting point. I don't know whether this is something we can share. It's something we've shared around Burges Salmon, but Pre's pulled together a really good reading list, and I can't admit to having read all the books, but I've certainly read a summary of a few of them. But there's some great resources out there, and it's I think that was a great starting point to learn, but also then be more confident discussing issues and having that dialogue. The second point to mention was what was important for me was to hear and actually listen to different voices. I read much more widely than I usually do, talking particularly around the toppling of the statue, but that I started with more familiar places to me, which was BBC, but actually realised I needed to go much broader and spread out to, I suppose, people I knew around the city who I respected, and then connected with people that they were connected with, and it spiraled out so that actually I was hearing many different voices. But what also happened was I was hearing different voices in very opposing voices, and some of the more powerful comments for me were actually some of the fairly unpleasant commentary that I was reading on, without tarring the Bristol Post, but a publication like the Bristol Post, and comments that were being published there or on Twitter from trolls and the like. That made me realise that I was oblivious to a lot of what was going on in society at the moment. And the final point is, I suppose, for listening and learning to be continuous. And it's something I need to make sure that it wasn't a one-off, and that I keep listening and learning. The David Olusoga, his series, both in terms of The House Through Time, but also Forgotten Black History, and like has been great. But also conversations like this, we're having them within Burges Salmon, but I think having them across the legal sector and elsewhere is really important to make sure that this is an ongoing learning process and journey for everyone. So I think, in summary, for me, that speaking up, which is really important, is difficult, but it's certainly made easier by listening and learning, and having done some reflection. I'll hand over to Nikoletta and Emily now, who will talk about reflecting.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you so much for sharing such honest personal reflections with everyone. Your reflection is indeed a necessary process that people who are committed to becoming good allies must go through. And when we're talking about reflection, we mean reflecting on the ways that we, as white people, have actually benefited from a racist system, sometimes without even noticing. And in other words, reflecting on our white skin privilege. What is white skin privilege? So there's often a misconception that when we are talking about white skin privilege, we are assuming that white people have never struggled in their life, that everything they have accomplished is unearned. And that's definitely not the case. Most white people who have achieved a high level of success have worked incredibly hard to get there. Instead, what white privilege means is that the color of your skin, a white person's skin, does not impact their life's trajectory in a negative way, and sometimes it may actually give them an advantage. Life is generally hard. A white person's life is hard, but white privilege means that the color of your skin is not one of the factors making it harder. And one of the most groundbreaking essays on this topic was actually published in 1988 by Peggy McIntosh, and I have referenced the title of this on the slide. And in this essay, Peggy talks about how, as a white person, she realized that she had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts her at an advantage. And examples of such advantages could be that most of the people at work look like you, or products like hair products are designed for you, or the fact that you are the dominant representation in all media and movies. And finally, another advantage that I have been personally reflecting upon recently is the fact that for so many years, and even now sometimes, I have been able to just hear about a racist event when that was all over the media, think about it for a while, say, oh, that this is really bad, and then just switch it off and ignore it. And that in itself, the ability to switch off, is a privilege. And I will now hand over to Emily, who will share some of her reflections and ways that we can recognize our privilege and use it positively to advocate for those at a disadvantage.
Thank you, Nikoletta. And I think that was a really useful explanation of what white privilege is. And I think the picture on the screen depicts it perfectly. So I'm going to talk about how allies can use white privilege to bring about change. The first thing we need to do is to recognise and acknowledge our privilege. And this requires us to educate ourselves. So there's so much to learn about how the systems that exist make life easier for white people. And over the past few months particularly, so many resources have been shared. However, it's not a case of reading a few books and passing an exam that says you now understand white privilege or are anti-racist. It needs to be constant. We need to be constantly asking questions of one another, those in more senior positions, and of ourselves as to how the systems we come into contact with favour white people. And acknowledging privilege requires us to accept that we benefit from a structurally unfair system, and this concept can make people feel uncomfortable. But as allies, we need to proactively check our mindset and make sure that we do not get defensive when thinking or talking about privilege, because being defensive about privilege can be really problematic, as it can minimise the very real experiences and challenges that marginalised groups face, and can also silence really important conversations which can actually prevent change. So obviously acknowledging white privilege is not enough. It has to lead to action. But by educating ourselves and acknowledging privilege, we will become better at identifying structural racism and the systems in place that make life harder for Black people. At this point, we need to use whatever platforms or positions we have to amplify Black voices and call out racism in all forms, including structural racism and microaggressions. An example might be asking people in senior positions about diversity statistics, recruitment processes, and blind CVs, for example, or challenging people when you are asked to speak on an all-white panel. We should identify the contacts we have, including friends, colleagues, and other professionals, perhaps in any networks we're part of, in order to continue the conversation with them. Finally, we should make a conscious effort to use white privilege when we see racism. White privilege means that it's often easier and safer for me as a white person to challenge anti-Black racism. That in and of itself is an example of my white privilege, and as allies we need to recognise situations where, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, we can use our voices or take action to confront racism. And to end on a reflective point, I think one of the key things that I've learned is that using white privilege means that as a white person, I have to use my voice more than just to call out overt racism. I remember thinking that because I don't experience racism, my voice shouldn't be heard, and that I don't have anything to add. And to be honest, these things do remain true. When it comes to people's experiences or views, my role should always be to listen. But what I now realise is that white privilege means that I'm regularly in spaces where the vast majority of people are white, be it that with family, friends, at work, or even on social media. And using white privilege means having conversations about systemic racism on all of these platforms. And it's actually quite easy to have these conversations without the conversations being centered around myself. To give some examples, I can talk about a film or TV series I have watched, an interesting social media account I follow, or statistics I have seen. By reading books and listening to podcasts, I can then recommend these to people and amplify Black voices. I now recognise that as a white person, it's so important to have these conversations. Often talking about racism and sharing resources is left to Black friends and colleagues, and it's not the responsibility of Black people to educate people about racism. So I'm now going to hand over to Joelle, who is going to give some advice and tips on how to have these sometimes difficult conversations.
Hi everyone, as Emily mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about the final stage in the process, which is speaking up. So once you've done all the learning, this part is about putting that learning into action. And that involves talking to people about things they might have said which you view to be racist. I think this is probably the most difficult stage, or the most personally challenging. So you'll see on the slide that we've listed out some things you might hear and how to call them, and I'm going to give some tips on how to call these statements out. It's not a definitive list. And as Priscilla mentioned earlier, it's the way we have these conversations that's important. So whilst I've used the phrase calling out, I think that can sound quite confrontational, and it's important that the conversations are not held in a confrontational manner, that we make time to chat to each other and share helpful resources, as we've been doing here. After I've gone through this list, I'm going to share some of my personal experiences of trying to be a better ally. So the first thing you'll see on the list is, I don't see colour, we are all one human race. This statement denies oppression, marginalisation, and the discrimination experienced by people daily. It diminishes suffering and excuses our collective responsibility to be anti-racist. The second statement is, you must have misunderstood me. I think it's important to point out that racist acts are defined by their impact, not their intent, and it's important to give Black people the benefit of the doubt. Number 3, I'm not a racist person. This statement is based on the binary concept that there are good non-racist and bad racist people, and it's an oversimplification. Racism is often subconscious. We live in a racialized society, so racism is not only in bad people's minds. Number 4, I'm not responsible for my ancestors' actions. Am I supposed to feel bad about it? Priscilla and Jamie both mentioned earlier not offloading guilt as part of this process. Being anti-racist is not about feeling guilty, but it's about recognising our own privilege. It's about recognising if you benefit from generational wealth, prosperity and opportunity, and recognising that you have the privilege of the colour of your skin not being a barrier to your success. The 5th phrase focuses on the concept of reverse racism. This really is an issue over the definition of racism. Racism requires privilege and power. So whilst you might face prejudice as a white person, you don't face racism because your race is in power. Number 6, why do you make everything about race? The reality is everything is about race. It is easy not to notice racism if it doesn't affect you, but a quick Google of statistics in relation to race shows that it permeates our society. For example, if you start at school, white British students are 3 times more likely to achieve high grades than Black Caribbean students, according to the Department of Education. Moving into employment, between 2004 to 2018, Black people had at least double the level of unemployment as white people. 68% of white British people own their own home, compared to only 37% of Black Caribbean people. And then more recently, BAME individuals are 2 times more likely to die from COVID, and it was found that they're not genetically predisposed. The last phrase, all lives matter. All lives can't matter until Black lives matter. You'll see the picture of the houses on fire on the slide, and this did the rounds on social media, so probably most of you have seen it before. You wouldn't be very happy if your house was on fire and the fire brigade turned up and hosed down the house next door, because all homes matter. It's important we advocate for the most marginalised and for those who need it most at the time. In terms of my own personal experiences, I found speaking up to people that I know is extremely difficult. I commented to Priscilla earlier that I was much more nervous for the internal presentation that we did at Burges Salmon than the external one. As Nikoletta mentioned, it is really tiring thinking and talking about racism, and it's good to remember when you're tempted to have a day off that others can't. It's a privilege not to have to think about racism. And talking about racism is not political, but a moral standpoint. I think that's often used to try to silence discussions on this issue. And lastly, you will make mistakes, and it's how you react to those mistakes that matter. I definitely have made mistakes, and I think the most important thing is to listen and learn from them and react positively. So I'm going to hand over to Sandra now, who's going to take us through some next steps.
Thanks, Joelle. So next, I am going to briefly cover things that you could do in the workplace and outside the workplace beyond today. I'm conscious that we've got some students who are also on the webinar, so the things that I'm going to mention in relation to the workplace can be applied at university as well. Firstly, I think a key message which was covered by the previous speakers is really the importance of educating yourself. It's really important to educate yourself on Black people's experiences and on systemic racism. By doing this, you'll be able to identify race and ethnicity issues within the workplace and society more widely. You can do this through watching relevant movies, TV shows, or reading books. Feel free to share any additional resources that you found useful in the chat function. However, as important as education is, it's generally futile if it's not accompanied by any form of action. So here's a brief list of things that you can do specifically at the workplace beyond today. The first thing that you could do that's important is to show up. It's really important to attend events, seminars, and conferences, including sessions like the one today aimed at promoting Black inclusion. The purpose of these events tends to be to educate and inform people, and they're one of the best places to go to be proactively curious and to ask questions. After these events, talk to your colleagues and peers, regardless of their ethnicity, and about what you've heard or learned. The second thing that you can do that's important is to speak up and speak out. It's important to advocate for your Black colleagues and speak up for them where they don't have a seat at the table. It's also important to speak out against racist derogatory remarks at work. More than a third of BAME employees surveyed by Trade Union Congress in 2017 experienced racial bullying, abuse, and racial discrimination in the workplace. Keeping quiet when you hear such racist remarks in the workplace only exacerbates the problem and makes the work environment more uncomfortable for your BAME colleagues. The third thing that you can do in the workplace is to sponsor and mentor your Black colleagues. Allies can play an important role in nurturing the careers of talented Black people through not only mentoring, but also through sponsoring. This can open up access to networks and other development opportunities that they may not otherwise have access to. Mentoring and sponsoring can also help to overcome barriers to career progression that Black people face in the workplace. So moving on to things that you could do outside the workplace or university beyond today. I think it's really important to start at home. I think it's important to confront racist family members and friends and to call out problematic language or microaggressions, even when it's uncomfortable and even when there aren't any Black people around. Friends and family are more likely to be open to listening to constructive criticism in that setting. You can also diversify the books that you read, the shows that you watch, and the books and toys that you get for your children so that they have an appreciation of diversity from a young age. The second thing that you can do is engage with the wider community. For example, you can support charities like SARI, Babasa, or the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, which all seek to tackle racial injustice and support BAME people generally. You can also sign petitions, join protests that seek to tackle racial injustice and speak out on social media if you're comfortable doing so. The last thing that you could do is to support Black-owned businesses. Supporting Black-owned businesses helps to close the racial wealth gap. A recent report published by Runnymede Trust revealed that for every £1 a white British family has, Black Caribbean households have about 20p and Black African households have about 10p. A new initiative called Black Pound Day was sparked by the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer. The idea is that once a month you buy a product from a Black-owned business. The initiative aims to empower the Black community and grow the Black economy by changing shopping habits so that they become more inclusive. Taking part in this initiative is one way you can show your support and also help close the racial wealth gap. The lists I've just gone through are obviously by no means a list of exhaustive things that you can do in and outside of the workplace. However, they are a useful starting point if you're struggling to know where to start. So I'll now hand over back to Pri, who will have a look to see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Sandra. So we are now moving into the Q&A section of the webinar, and we want to say thank you so much for submitting all your questions. We've been overwhelmed by the number that we've received, so we may not be able to get to all of them, but we have gone through them and picked out the most common themes and questions, and hopefully some of the others will have been answered during the course of this presentation. But that said, please do feel free to put any comments in the chat or ask any burning questions that we haven't covered, and we'll answer as many as we can. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. And so our first question is, how comfortable do you feel in your workplace environment that you would be able to call out racism when you witness or experience it, particularly as a trainee or someone in a junior position? And how confident are you in your firm that something will be done about it? So Emily, I think it would be interesting to hear from you as a trainee on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question. And I think Joelle mentioned that calling out racism can and often is difficult, no matter what environment you're in. So whether that's kind of with close friends and family or at work. I think for me, I definitely feel kind of better equipped to call out racism, having done kind of some more reading and listening to podcasts and things like that. And I think Jamie already touched on that as well. So I think that's helpful. But yeah, I think kind of the question gets at how comfortable would I be as a trainee, and maybe that kind of refers to calling out racism if it comes from someone more senior. And I think in that scenario, if I kind of didn't feel like I could call out the remark in the moment, I would probably now go to someone like Jamie or some of the other kind of more senior people that I now know through the Be Cultured network, and yeah, have a discussion with them about how best to raise it. It might be that they could even kind of raise it on my behalf, and I think that's probably one of the really great things about networks like Be Cultured. You do kind of have access to people to go to it who are at different levels of seniority at the firm. And in terms of how confident I would be that it would be dealt with, I think I would be very confident, and I think that comes down to leadership at the very top. So I know that kind of the people in the most senior positions at the firm do take or would take a racist comment very seriously. So yeah, I do have confidence. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else.
I think I could add one bit in, not necessarily on that, Emily, but I saw there was another question came in on a similar point in terms of dealing with racism with clients rather than peers in the workplace. Do we have any tips on that? And I think that's incredibly difficult. I've had to deal with it once when I was advising a client on who to use as a barrister in a particular case. And my recommendation happened to be female and from an ethnic minority, and I thought very strongly to use them, and ultimately the client refused and said that they wanted a white male of a certain age to be to represent them. And ironically, that individual, the client, was actually from an ethnic minority themselves, but they viewed it as important for their particular case, which I found very sad. And other than feeling incredibly uncomfortable and pushing as hard as I could and explaining why I thought my recommendation was right, I wasn't able to persuade them. I think generally what I would suggest is similar to what Emily talked about, is using using trusted senior colleagues. So if there was a client who made a comment I was uncomfortable with, I would be going to the partner, the relationship partner for that that particular client, and we'd be having a discussion about how to deal with it. But I don't know if anyone else has got any other thoughts other than that. That is an incredibly difficult one to deal with.
I was just going to add on to Emily's point about senior management taking a racist comment very seriously. I think one thing I can vouch for is that we do have buy-in from senior people within the firm, which is really helpful, so the messaging is clear that it won't be tolerated. So I would feel confident that it would be dealt with if something like that did happen, and I reported it. Does anyone have anything else to add on that question? Yeah, I'll move on to the next one, which is, how do you stop the most undesirable aspects of current thought on Black Lives Matter? And I guess this is probably to do with the movement, the distinction, between the movement and the Black Lives Matter organisation. And I would just say that it's important to kind of separate the two and recognise that Black Lives Matter in itself as a movement is something that is quite uncontroversial. It's something we're supporting the aims of ending racial injustice. And so while there is the organisation and the various issues with that, what we're supporting here is the message that Black lives do matter, not that other lives don't matter, but that all lives can't matter until Black lives do. And so, yeah, looking at that separate from the organisation, that's what we support and that's what we're standing for. Does anyone have anything to add on that? So the next question, some law firms have announced targets for the future diversity of their workforce. What does the panel feel about setting targets? Sandra, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Bree. My personal view is that I think targets are really important because they help organizations, they help to hold organizations accountable, and it helps them to measure performance. So, and you know, a lot of companies nowadays are setting sort of diversity targets, including, you know, the Fortune 500. I think if we are talking about quotas, I think then that's slightly different. I think the danger with sort of quotas is that you end up sort of filling roles rather than doing that based on merit. And there's a danger of creeping into tokenism. So I think targets generally, in my view, I would say, I think they are useful for organizations generally. I don't know if the question is leaning more towards quotas. If so, I think quotas can be a bit controversial. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add.
Yeah, I think you captured everything there, especially around tokenism and not veering into that. The next question, should unconscious bias training be introduced as a compulsory part of the period of recognised training? Does anyone want to chip in on this?
I could start on that. I think unconscious bias training, yes, is helpful, but I think it's one part of a long-term journey, and there are, I suppose, some dangers with unconscious bias training. One, that I think there was a whole raft of firms and other organisations who basically used unconscious bias training as their diversity initiatives, and it almost stopped there. And so it becomes more of a tick box. You've gone through it, fine, which obviously misses the point. I think there's also a danger with how the training is positioned, that it almost tells you that unconscious bias is inevitable and there isn't anything you can do about it. And so I suppose I would see it as a helpful part of a toolkit, but it needs to, it's almost a starting place for a journey, or an early stage part of a journey, but needs to be built on.
Yeah, I'd agree that it is just a small part of the bigger, if we think about that, the iceberg picture of racism, there's structural, there's overt, and so unconscious bias would only tackle a tiny piece of that. So while it is useful for highlighting biases that people may have, it's not the be all and end all, and it's not going to, in and of itself, end racism. And I know we've also talked about the language around unconscious bias training and how people generally don't like being told that they're doing things wrong. And so, in fact, there have been studies that have shown that it can sometimes have the opposite effect of getting people's backs up, essentially, and making them more defensive, which ultimately doesn't help the aim. But I wouldn't say that it should be cancelled because of that, but I think it's just important to note that there are other things that should be done to tackle racism other than just unconscious bias training. So the next question, do you think compulsory ethnicity pay gap reporting would help address the imbalance in BAME representation in top leadership roles at law firms? Jamie, I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I suppose I've got a couple of angles to it. One as an employment lawyer, it would obviously be helpful for me because it will probably generate some work. But I'll try and take my employment law hat off for that. I think in terms of will it actually address it? No, it's a similar point to unconscious bias. It's another I think useful part of the sort of toolkit. So on its own it won't, but I do think it would help personally. I think what it does, same way as it has with gender pay reporting, and that's still in early days, but it helps shine a light on representation. And I think there's sort of two angles to it where I think it's helpful. One is internally, and Sandra was talking about this earlier in terms of the importance of starting to measure the right things and also to be measuring progress. So I think ethnicity pay reporting would help with that internally, and also both in terms of measuring where you are, but also your progress over time. Externally, I guess one of the key drivers for law firms is winning business. Short-termism, I suppose procurement and pitch processes, we are seeing increasingly that people are asking questions, and questions more broadly about the organisation. And I think if you've got measures and reports like ethnicity pay, that is likely to find its way into procurement processes and may well be influencing. I know there are certain organisations out there who've said that they will be awarding legal contracts on the basis of progress against diversity targets. So I think from that perspective there could be business drivers for it where it would help. The one caveat, I suppose, with an employment law hat on is I don't think ethnicity pay reporting is easy. It's not as straightforward as gender pay reporting, and I think one of the challenges we do report on our ethnicity pay, but we don't necessarily have all the information that we would need to report as accurately as we would like. And there's also questions, I suppose, about how you would report and how you would break up people into different ethnicities, nationalities, etc. So it's not a simple question, but I think I think it would be a helpful step forward.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I would agree with that. Does anyone else want to chip in? The next question, What are you doing to ensure that there are Black people represented in senior management and the highest level of decision making within your corporation?
I'd say our BAME group is trying to do a lot of work in this space. So we have a subcommittee within B Culture that is responsible for recruitment and progression. And one of the things they look at is getting people through the door and retaining people within the organization and making sure that those people are able to progress through the ranks. So I think as a firm, we are trying to do that. However, it takes time for people to climb up and step up the ladder in that regard. I think the firm is generally supportive of the initiatives that we're doing as a group, but I think that's one of the main things we are doing as a firm. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add.
Just to add on the getting people through the door point, because this is one of our priorities at the moment, reaching out to communities and encouraging people to apply for the training contracts, and then once these people are in the firm, like make it feel inclusive and support them as they're moving up the ranks. So as Sandra says, it's a long process, and it starts with reaching out to communities and getting people, giving people the courage to apply and get inspired by role models in law firms and go for it.
So I just add in that I completely agree. It's about a long-term investment in sort of the journey, but there are things you can do in the short term, and I suppose we don't have a strong representation at the senior level as we would like, but I think that the voices of all our people do get heard, and through Be Cultured, that provides a really good way for voices and perspectives from our BAME network to be heard by the most senior level. So we've got 2 representatives from Be Cultured on our diversity and inclusion group, which reports directly up to the partnership committee, and they're actively looking for views and perspectives on certain initiatives we're looking to do, and where we're looking to do new initiatives, perhaps bouncing those off people from Be Cultured to get thoughts on how things will best be taken forward. So I think it is a long-term journey, but there are things you can do in the short term to make sure that all voices are heard.
Just to touch on that as well, because I'm conscious that we've got students on the webinar, and I think it's really important to mention the importance of disclosing your background and application forms. So one of the things we're doing as a network is trying to see whether we're actually getting enough applications from BAME students. And one of the difficulties we have in doing that is that students sometimes don't disclose their ethnicity on the application form for whatever reason. But that information is actually really important for law firms, because it allows them to see why it is that they aren't getting or don't have the BAME representation that they need. Is it because they're not getting any applications at all from BAME individuals, or is it that they are getting applications from BAME individuals but they're just not getting through to the next stage for whatever reason? So I would urge all students on the webinar that if you are applying, that information is really important for recruitment purposes.
Yeah, I agreed. And sorry, I've just seen a question from Sada, or a comment, which I think is a really good one. It's around reverse mentoring, and it should have mentioned that. Again, that's part of voices being heard and getting being heard at the most senior level. So the question, would we consider it? Yes, and we have in fact done it. So I think, Sandra, you may have been involved, and certainly I'm looking externally actually, but I'm involved in reverse mentoring in some community organisations and projects that I'm involved. So yeah, I think that's really, really important and really valuable. I don't know if you want to share any of your experience, Sandra or Pri.
We do actually have a reverse mentoring session with senior management booked in, I think 2 weeks from now, and this will be the second. The first one Sandra was involved in, so she might be able to tell you more about that, but that is part of the process of making sure that our voices are heard, even though we're not in senior management positions yet. There is the representation and the channels of communication there to make sure that we are represented in decision making.
Yeah, I think the first session that we had was really useful, and the purpose of that session was just to find out from individuals in the firm what their experience has been like at the firm as a BAME individual, good or bad, and what the firm could be doing to improve their experiences. And it was really honest and frank conversations with people in senior management. And I must say, some of the conversations that were had were a bit shocking to them, because they aren't privy to what actually goes on the ground sometimes. So it is useful to have those honest and frank conversations with people in those positions, because they're the ones that, you know, are essential for driving change, and they need the honest views of, you know, people in those marginalized groups. So yeah, it was a really useful session.
And another plug, actually, for the Stepping Up programme. So we've been involved in the Stepping Up programme for a number of years now, and that's been really valuable. So if you're not involved in that in sort of organisations around Bristol, that would be something that's worth getting involved in.
Thanks, everyone. We're just conscious of time. We've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to wrap up here. Sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions, but I know people have asked for resources, so I'll speak to Coralie about getting the reading list and also the link for Black Pound Day circulated after this talk. But thank you again all for coming and for submitting your questions, and we hope that this has been helpful. Yeah, thank you. I'll hand over to Coralie now.
Yep, thank you very much, everyone, and big thank you to all our panellists today on behalf of Bristol Law Society, and I'm sure on behalf of all our attendees as well. As Priscilla mentioned, we will be sending around the resources and a link to the webinar after this session. It might not necessarily be today, but we'll do it as soon as we can. And that was all I just wanted to say. Just thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon.
Okay, okay, it's saying there's one attendee there, but I can't actually see anybody there, so I think it's just the panellists now. Fantastic, I thought that was an excellent session, really informative. I will, I'm going to edit that now, and yeah, my children are going to be sat down in front of this. So thank you very much indeed. Priscilla, can I just ask you a question? Are you okay for me to share your slides as well as part of that? If you could send them, actually if you send them to Claire, you'll have her email, I guess, won't you, from Zoom, so that would be fantastic. I'll also, there's some questions, I think there's 3 questions in the Q&A section, and also there was quite a lot of commentary in the chat, so I will extract that and let you have that as well, because I think for your purposes as well, there'll be some interesting things in there. And if there's any information that we can again forward on to delegates from that, I'll try and extract that as well. I think there were some reading lists and various things, weren't there? But anything else that any of you want to add?
No, just to say thank you for facilitating the webinar. It's always really useful to have people sort of controlling the functions. So yeah, thank you for that. Thanks to you and Coralie for organising.
And Coralie has done the majority of the work, and yeah, just from our perspective, you know, really thrilled to be able to host this, and also knowing that we can pop it onto Facebook, onto YouTube as well, and hopefully it will get some more coverage. But it will go. The link will go to everybody who registered. I think we had at the height we had something like I think we had 54, 55 delegates. So you know, I don't think that you know, I mean, that's a good number in itself, but in terms of those who booked, I don't think that's a bad return. But all of those who did book, we had nearly 100, will get the link anyway, so hopefully they'll watch it if they couldn't make it. Lovely. Right, I shall let you all go back to your day jobs, but thanks again. You know, really important session, and I'll be yeah, forwarding to everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It was really good, because it's quite hard to pull these sessions together, so really appreciate you guys doing that, because I know you did it before, but it's always that slightly different angle, so it's really useful, because I think it's important to spread the message as widely as we can. So thank you.
There was an interesting point coming up in the chat, sorry Coralie, but
yeah,
about the range of counsel being used and supporting female ethnic minority barristers. Just wondering about, yeah, whether there are certain things that come up from the comment. I was trying to flick through the other one, but are there some useful actions that might inform ongoing discussions there? Because I think it is, that's quite an interesting point, isn't it? And how do we bring everyone into that discussion? But we need to be thinking beyond our sort of four walls of the office, and how we can support people across the city and externally.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think with that, I mean, I think, you know, everyone's doing a lot of work. I think behind the scenes, I think it's we're still quite early days, but as Priscilla and Sandra will know, we are doing a sort of cross-firm BAME lawyers network as such, and then we hope to use that as a sort of driver to reach the wider profession through Bristol Law Society, and then hopefully more action points will come out of that, and it will grow some momentum and keep it going. I think that's sometimes the hardest part, keeping the conversation going.
Coralie, I'm happy to. I don't know whether you know her, Coralie, and all of you involved in that group, but I'm connected with Kate Brunner, QC at Albion, who's head of the Western Circuit, and I know when we did the wellbeing session, she couldn't attend it a few weeks ago, but sent Fiona Elder on that one, but made it clear that she's very happy to help in whatever way she can on issues. So I think you know, if I send you Kate's details, then that's probably a good person to try.
Yeah, that'd be really good. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, that's great. I'll get on to editing and pulling off this information and let you have it all very shortly.
Thank you. I'll send you the slides. I'll send them to Claire.
Lovely.
Well
That's absolutely, and I'll see you at 5, Jamie.
Yeah, lovely.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.